Hello, everyone. Welcome to my speech on human remains in museums. Today, I hope that I can persuade you to agree with me that human remains should not be shown in museums. Before we get in to the main meat of the speech, though, just some housekeeping things. The first is that I am recovering from the flu, so please, I am apologizing for my voice and that I might cough at the top of the speech. Also, some qualifications for today. I will mostly be discussing human remains in museums of science, specifically human remains that have been deceased prior to the 21st century. Today, I am not talking about mummies or Egyptian funerary collections or anything like that. So if that's what you're expecting, take that idea up, toss it into can. That's not what I'm discussing today. With all that being said, I'm going to move forward. So today, I'm going to first discuss where we're at with human remains in museums, and then I'm going to discuss the history of museums and the history of human remains being used for science. And then I will discuss a case study and use the Mutter Museum, which is a medical museum in Philadelphia. And then I'm going to conclude our speech today with what I think we should do next. All right, so remains in museums today, specifically human remains in museums today. So why do we not want to display human remains in museums? You may be thinking to yourself, what's the big deal? Well, I'm here to tell you what the big deal is. So the field of museum studies has mostly come to an ethical agreement on human remains in the context of art museums, natural history museums, and anthropology museums. So in the context of those museums, it is generally frowned upon to show human remains. One of the big reasons is a religious reason. So in certain religions, it can be contaminating for somebody to see human remains, and then they have to go through a big process to decontaminate their body before they're allowed to worship again. There's an issue of a lack of consent. A lot of the times the remains that have been displayed, those people passed a while ago. And so we can no longer ask them if it's okay to display their remains. There are also some histories of colonization. The Penn Museum, which is also in Philadelphia, had skulls of people who have since been deceased displayed. And these skulls came from the remains of enslaved people, enslaved African Americans. And so obviously those people couldn't give their consent for their remains to be displayed and used for a teaching and learning collection. And there's also a history of colonization and enslavement there. And so we want to be respectful of all people even after they've passed. And the last one is kind of a big one. It's called NAGPRA, and that stands for Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. This was a law passed in 1990 that shifted the museum field to move away from displaying human remains, specifically human remains of Native Americans. And part of the main meat of this act was that museums and other government entities had to return Native American objects related to graves and funerary practices. So this includes objects that would have been used in a funerary practice and also human remains and ancestral remains. So that's where most museums are today. Science museums are the exception to this rule, where you will, if you go to a museum of science, there is still a high chance that you will see human remains in the form of a skeleton or something like that. So moving on, the history of human remains in science and also in museums. So here we go. Quickly, a little history of museums for those of you who are not familiar. In the 15th century, European explorers, I say this in parentheses, they're usually exploring land that indigenous people already inhabited. So they didn't really explore anything. Anyway, but they brought back discoveries from the locations they traveled to. The Enlightenment period in Europe, early scientists sought to collect what they found to be curiosities, which sometimes included living people and also their remains. Um, and they would document these curiosities. And then nobles and scholars would display their finds in cabinets for other European viewers to contemplate and sort of look at in awe and wonder. These cabinets were called cabinets of curiosity or curio cabinets. And so I have a photo. Here we can see a cabinet of curiosity or a curio cabinet. There are lots of different things in here. So just take a moment to drink that all in because there's a lot going on in this image. And then skeletons remained part of museum displays as cabinets of curiosity transitioned from being cabinets to museum institutions. And also human remains were part of the museum studies in the 1800s and the early 1900s as human skulls were examined in an attempt to prove that Anglo-Saxons were racially superior to other races. So a troubled history, we'll say, definitely a troubled history. Moving on, I'm now going to talk about the history of human remains in science. So prior to the 1980s, many human remains were exported from India, but in 1985, India outlawed this practice. So you may be wondering how did this happen? How did this industry come to be in India? Well, this began in India from its history as a colony of the British Empire. As a colony of the British Empire, human remains were exported to be used to study by European and English doctors, sometimes as cadavers and sometimes as specifically bone specimens. In 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed in the UK, ending the import and export of corpses from India to the UK. However, the process was still there. So once you outlaw an industry like that, if you don't cut it, if you don't rip it out at the roots, it'll just go back other places. So even though it was illegal for the UK and India to import and export bones, it was not illegal for India to have that relationship with other European countries yet. So the relationship continued, and other European countries still used India as a source for human remains to be used and examined for medical purposes until 1985, when India outlawed this practice. Unfortunately, it still does take place in India as part of the black market because there's such a big history there. So moving on to a case study, we can see that the history of human remains in museums is problematic, to say the least, and it's high time that I think we removed human remains from museums. But now we're going to talk about a very specific instance of a human remain in a museum of science, and specifically the Moody Museum. I will warn you now, on the next, I think not the next slide, but the slide after that, there is an image of the remains of a woman. And so once that image we move past it, I will let you know. So if you would like to not look at the screen for that, that's totally fine. So the Moody Museum, it's a museum in Philadelphia, and I understand that y'all might not know what it is. So, but it's a museum of science in Philadelphia, and its mission, as I have stated here, the mission of the museum is the museum helps the public understand the mysteries and beauty of the human body and to appreciate the history of diagnosis and treatment of disease. So specifically what I'm going to be talking about is the Soap Lady, and this is an exhibit in the Moody Museum. And it is the remains of a woman who probably passed in 1830. She was preserved by a fatty substance called adipochloride that encases her remains. So she's thought to have died from a yellow fever outbreak. She was exhumed in Philadelphia in 1875. So she was buried and then they dug her up. That's basically what that means. And so now this next slide will be an image of her, just so everybody knows. You do not have to look. But here she is. So this exhibit she is referred to as the Soap Lady by the museum staff and by people who visit the museums and just in the general lexicon. But it's important to note that this woman is actually a Jane Doe, pardon me. And this Jane Doe term acknowledges that this woman still has identities to be found, and it acts of a way of giving respect because it does not strip or replace her original identity. Calling her the soap lady has overtaken her original identity. After visitors come and see her remains, it's very common to refer to her in disrespectful and dehumanizing way, and for visitors to make jokes about her body and also call her the soap lady. So even though the intent of the museum is to educate the public on diseases and medical abnormalities, we can see a way in which they're trying to do this, and this woman and her remains are instead being dehumanized, to the point where like it's clear that we don't know her name, but instead the public has christened her with another nickname that's not very kind and not very humanizing. So I think that this example speaks volume as to why maybe until such a time where maybe we could become more respectful, we should not exhibit human remains in museums. So this is everything I said already. So what to do instead of displaying these remains, you might be thinking. It's important for people to see human remains in science museums. Well, a lot of things that you can see in the Muda Museum or in a museum of science can be displayed with just as much accuracy and efficacy with a cast mold. So that's one solution if you would still like to display those kinds of things. The only difference is that if you were really to be a doctor, there are certain things about bones that, yes, are different that you cannot always catch in a casting, but for the general public, there's no reason that these can't be cast. And so that would give all the factual information, and you'd be able to see it. It's just the same, but it would be a mold or a cast, and it would not be a real person's bones or remains. So now what? Let's say no longer can these science museums show human remains. Well, what to do with them now? In cases where remains can be given to their descendants, they should be returned. And this is an extension of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. Those people whose ancestors were displayed in museums, it is now law that you must return them. And now there is a law that is working on being passed. It's not a law yet. It's just a bill still, which is AGPRA, which is the African American Graves and Repatriation Act. And you might remember the example I talked about at the beginning from the Penn Museum, where there were skulls that were used for physical anthropology that were actually the skulls of enslaved people, so they could not have consented for their bodies being used for science. And so that this law would repatriate their skulls to the community. In cases where a person's descendants cannot be identified, they should be taken off display until arrangements can be made for their proper burial, so they can get their last rites. There you go. So there are some exceptions to this. And the exception is that if somebody has specifically requested to be displayed after dying. So there was a woman who visited the Muda Museum a bunch and really loved it. And her final wish, her name was Carol, her final wish was to donate her body to the Muda Museum to be hung next to this person's remains. His name was Harry, and those are his remains. But her wish was to be hung in the Muda Museum with her skeleton next to Harry's skeleton. And it was her death wish, basically, to hang in the Muda Museum. And so that's fine. She's specifically asking for it. She has agency to ask for that. Then that's fully welcome for her to display her remains. But in conclusion, human remains should not be displayed in museums because of the problematic nature of their history and the absence of consent in many displays. And also the dehumanization that it can bring about. Once we see bones in a display, it's a lot easier to think about them as just bones and not something that belonged to a human being at one point. I look forward to the questions that I'm sure you guys will have for me in class. Thank you so much for listening.